Now the floor is all yours. I will take comments and questions in 2 rounds. So I see 3 hands, and I start with the priority to the female colleague here. Yes, if you can get the mic there.
Thank you. So those were all very interesting presentations, and I'm left trying to figure out what I should think about the theme of the plenary. I was wondering if we could have Marc Lavoie and Jonathan Harris respond to David Colander's point that that the mainstream isn't open in terms of the textbooks to alternative ideas. I thought that was very provocative, especially the way that you started your talk, and it would be very interesting to hear them respond to that very concretely.
Brilliant. Yes. Now here I have Tom Pally. Sorry, could you have introduced yourself as well?
Heather Boucher, Washington Center for Equitable Growth.
Okay. And please remember to introduce yourselves. Not everyone can maybe be familiar with you.
Tom Pally from the AFL-CIO. Thank you for your 3 very entertaining presentations. One thing that struck me was comparing Marc and David's presentation. Because Marc is the heterodox economist here, and I thought I expected a very critical presentation, and he was. He condemned the profession for getting it wrong. But actually, when I listened to David, I got an even, perhaps unwittingly, even deeper condemnation, because
not unwittingly.
Because what I'm hearing is that the economics profession is a criminal fraud. It actually knows that these things are wrong, or many people do, and is unwilling to change, or it's unwilling to do its job. And the publishers go along with it, so not only should we be prosecuting banksters, we now, at long last, have a case for prosecuting the professoriate, which is something I've long believed should be the case. I'd love to see a class action suit against Greg Mankiw and the Harvard department for going along with that. But one criticism, David, that I do have for you, thank you for speaking so honestly about our profession. I do think that you get something wrong here methodologically in your criticism of models. It is impossible for us to think about the world without models. And if you put to the test of a model that it be a mirror of reality, it's just not going to work. All models are in their essence a simplification. And I would urge you to drop that language. And if you want an illustration of why you should, I urge you to read a wonderful story by Borges called Fuentes and His Memory. Fuentes remembers everything but has no categories. And therefore, at the end of the day, he knows nothing.
Yeah, wonderful. There was a colleague in front of Tom. Here. Yes, after you.
Just nice and inefficient there. Yeah, I'm Stephen Kinsler from UL. So just a comment on teaching large classes. So I teach one class with 750 students in it. And it's taught in a concert hall. And I set a textbook this year, and I was given the role of teaching it, and 23 copies of that textbook were sold. So I would suggest that perhaps it's not the professors who are going to be innovated out of the market, but the textbook writers, I would suggest. The second thing is, and I wondered could the panel respond, I've heard a lot of the phrase, students can grasp this. I actually believe it's quite the opposite. I feel that students can grasp anything. It's just easier for us as professors to teach this particular way of thinking. I wonder, is it that we're maybe being a little bit patronizing for the students?
The colleague at the back. No. The colleague towards the side of the room.
Thanks a lot. Christoph Freidorf, PhD student at Erfurt University and lecturing currently at Alanus University of Applied Sciences. Thank you very much. It was really entertaining, like others said already. I wondered a little bit why it's much two of the presentations were a lot about the content and not so much about the meta discussion, the politics, and like how the system of textbooks works. And that's why I'm very thankful to David Colander for talking about that. And as there were some critical remarks already, I wouldn't go as far as my colleague to the left. But also a critical remark about that. Basically, to sum it up, I understood that you say, oh, it's the textbook market, it works like this, it's demand of lecturers who want to do it, and I'm fine with it because I get quite a lot of money out of it. So what I wanted to ask you, you described very well those rules and like how the market of textbook works. But I think that particularly you are someone who is a brand strong enough to break this vicious circle, so you could prove your well-intentions and really have a nice radical textbook published soon and compare it to the sales of your traditional textbook. Thank you.
We have two colleagues here. I'll make a second round, but if you have...
Thank you. My name is Ivan Ayala. I come from Universidad Complutense de Madrid from Spain. And I'd like to thank the three persons. The three presentations have been very interesting. I have two questions for Mr. Colander and Mr. Lavoie. The first one would be for Mr. Colander. You said that you don't believe that there are heterodox economists and mainstream economists. There are just good or bad economics. So could we say that in the current situation, bad economists and bad economics are driving the profession, first of all? And the second one would be for Mr. Lavoie, which is Ms. Onaran said at the beginning that we've seen many movements around the world demanding a more pluralistic. And one of them was the student claims that in Manchester was born. But I have some problems of seeing this as a student claim, since what I'm seeing, it is a political claim expressed through the students, and I'm seeing that the space for radical economists to be implemented is being constructed outside the economics profession, which is I'm saying this because of the situation of Spain, for example, or Greek economy. We're seeing that social movements outside the economic profession are putting in the table some demands for which the space is opening for heterodox economics. So the specific question would be, can the change inside economics be endogenous, or should we those who are advocating for a change within the economics profession should be pushing from outside also the economic profession, mainly from political movements outside? Thank you.
There was a click there, yes.
Yoon Kim, the UMass Boston. I have a question to the David Colander. So you said the models are half-truth, and you talked about the complexity framework. I was wondering that I suppose there are models also in complexity framework. In what sense do you think they provide more truth than the models in other frameworks?
Yes, can we now have maybe one round of responses from you, because you have collected already a lot of comments, 5 minutes about, and then we have a chance for a second round. Shall we start in the reverse order, maybe Jonathan with you? The responses to each other and the comments for 5 minutes,
Okay.
starting with you.
Okay. Well, I could address this question of patronizing students and also some of Marc's points. I think Marc's criticisms from a post-Keynesian perspective make perfect sense. But if you think about an introductory student who comes into a course knowing nothing, then I think you should have on the table things like the quantity theory of money, monetary base, money multiplier, crowding out and crowding in, and that students should be able to see different approaches, different perspectives on those concepts. So our objective in writing a text was not to write a specifically green Keynesian or post-Keynesian or whatever text, but to help lead students to understand the issues, the controversies, the debates. One reason, for example, that we have the quantity equation of money in there is because that's a good way to understand what Milton Friedman and the monetarists are about. Well, I don't agree with Milton Friedman and the monetarists, but I think students should be aware of this school of thought, and so it should be in there, and then I'm not going to editorialize. I'm not going to say, well, here's what Milton Friedman and the monetarists say, and they're all wrong. So I hope that this is not patronizing students, but trying to, help, open up to them the debates, the different points of view, and to give them a perspective which is not one that locks them in, and which also, I think, frankly, is somewhat incomprehensible. That is, if you take the standard aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, on the one hand, I think it's wrong, but on the other hand, I think you would be totally puzzled by it. If you're trying to see, how does this relate to the real world? What the heck is going on here? Why do you even have short run and supply and demand if it all ends up in the long run? It all seems contradictory and difficult to reconcile with common sense. So I think there are some practical issues there in teaching, some practical pedagogical issues, along with these questions of which view do you present, which model do you use. I do agree with Tom Palley's comment that you do need models. And I think, again, on the question of reaching or patronizing students, I think students can understand models, but that it's very easy to swamp introductory students with models. In other words, to have something which is too complex, too mathematical, and which just makes it impossible for students to apply their own critical intelligence and to say, well, how does this relate to the real world? Does it relate to the real world? And when I talk to people, just people I meet in conversation at parties or whatever who've taken an economics course, they also, I couldn't understand it. It was too abstract, So part of our goal here, I think, is to offer more heterodox and radical perspectives. Part of our goal is also just to make it relevant to the real world. And part of our quarrel with the classical approach is that it's not relevant to the real world, that it's highly abstracted, highly mathematical, and makes it difficult for students to have any intelligent critical response to it because it sort of overwhelms them. So we're grappling with sort of both of those things, with good pedagogy and also content.
Wonderful. David.
Since a lot of questions came to me, I'll try and go quickly. First, in terms of Tom's sort of sense, criminal fraud, I don't see it as criminal fraud. I see it, what's needed is humility on all sides, sort of what models shed light on. There's a lot we don't know about an extraordinarily complex economy. Sort of classical economists divided sort of knowledge into sort of art, which had to do with policy, and science, which had to do pretty much just with logical models. And they said you have theorems that follow logically, and that is something you can teach as part of science. Precepts immediately involve normative judgments, a whole variety of other judgments. They are really outside of science and shouldn't be seen as part of science. So when people combine the two, sort of that's the problem. Textbooks, I think, way too much combine the two, and so come to policy conclusions from models that don't follow without all the ancillary judgments, but they don't provide those ancillary judgments, and that's where I think they go wrong. So I try not to sort of draw many policy conclusions from them. I try and teach the models. So I kept the price on the axis, mainly because as soon as you put inflation on that axis, that aggregate demand curve, unless it's the reaction curve of the Fed, has very little meaning whatsoever, and I can get it shaped all different ways. And the supply curve has no justification other than an empirical justification. So the whole sense of modeling that you taught sort of is undermined. The ASAD model, I think, is an awful model, but at least it's a logically correct model given all the assumptions in that. As to, I think you just misunderstood me. I never said, thought models, we could do without models. All models are simplifications. You need simplifications. and have to use it. It was sort of seeing models as half-truths as opposed to sort of as truths on one side or the other that lead to any policy conclusions, and then get into debating the judgments. In terms of the textbooks, you know, sort of 700 students, 23, that's something that a lot of places are finding if you sort of base your exams on the notes. If you base them on the books, you probably get 150 people buying. So it used to consider it 1 million copies in the US. They're probably down to 650,000 now. So they're down quite a bit. They know that. That's why they're trying to sort of get you sort of here, we have self-grading exams for you. Our Connect policy will sort of do everything for you, and most of the people with 700 students sign up for one of those. They get in, and then sort of they sell them the online version of the text, and it goes up from 120 up to 700 because the students are forced to get it. So that's the publisher's, you know, sort of strategy at this point that's going on. In terms of, you know, so why don't I do an alternative text? I'm not allowed with my contract to do an alternative text, you know, that goes there. I did present a proposal to INET, sort of to supervise sort of an overall text done by sort of a whole group of people that would be what I call the for-benefit text. Nobody would be making any money on it. It would go there, but it would cover costs as an alternative to try and get a lot of major names. And I argued we could get some really top economists sort of who would do that, would provide the synthesis book of saying, here, we're trying to say it like it is, but I didn't get it accepted by INET. So I put that proposal in, and I put that proposal forward as something I think would be there, coming from people from all different sides, as opposed to it not being a heterodox text, but it being what I call the reasonable mainstream text. And I happen to believe there's a lot of reasonable mainstream economists out there who are sort of stuck in the system, so you're sort of forced to make some judgment. Here, you know, do I go and sort of put myself out, or do I operate in? And people are always making that judgment. And I sort of try and give people, you know, sort of the benefit of the doubt whenever I possibly can. In terms of the heterodox, you know, sort of mainstream division, I didn't mean that there isn't a division there. You know, I meant I don't see it as useful to consider oneself as heterodox. I think if you're presenting yourself to journalists as a heterodox economist, you undermine, you know, oh, that's sort of a heterodox. Here, this is good economics. And so if somebody calls me heterodox, I have no problem being called heterodox. I just say, here, I am mainstream, and this is what good mainstream economics is. I think that is more, you know, likely to affect things than others. So that's the reason. It isn't that, you know, so I'm against heterodox or anything else. It's just I don't think it's a very useful strategy in conveying the ideas. Because, you know, a lot of post-Keynes, like endogenous money, that's made sense for so long and had such a hard way to get in when, you know, it's just so obvious and sort of looking at it. And finally, in terms of the complexity framework, what it does is sort of say, here we have to picture the overall economy as this evolutionary system. And complex systems are extraordinarily complicated in terms of sort of sets of nested institutions, all developed there and constantly evolving. Incentives are not done in terms of prices. Incentives are done in terms of the institutional structure. What incentives sort of operate there? How do I get tenure? What do I do? That's the way in which I think people have to think about it, and then think about policy in terms of changing those eco-structures, changing those institutions so that you get better results, not by changing people's incentives, but by changing the structures that are there. So the thing I'm working on now is for-benefit institutions, corporations, as opposed to for-profit corporations. Really sort of trying to mobilize social entrepreneurship. That lots of the entrepreneurs, and this came from rich entrepreneurs who made hundreds of millions of dollars and then got bored, didn't want to give it away to for-profit institutions because or not-for-profits, because they felt they were inefficient. They felt they could do it much better. And so what they attempted to do was sort of go and sort of use their expertise, not to try and make money, but to try and make a better system. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Marc.
Right. David always likes to make outrageous comments. I
didn't say anything outrageous.
I just want to talk about what he said about replacing professors. Pretty soon there'll be none of them. I remember that back in 1979, I was at a cocktail at the Canadian High Commission in London, and an Italian professor of nuclear physics, told me exactly that pretty soon there won't be, everybody will be taking online courses from Harvard University or whatever, and we won't be there anymore. So this was said 35 years ago, but we are not there yet. He was also saying that nuclear power was the power of the future. About complex systems, which David has been pushing for a while. He used to call it post-Walrasian economics. Now it's called complexity systems, complexity. So on the one hand, he is telling us we shouldn't use the word heterodox, but he's using all these names. So I find that a little bit ironic. Anyway, we had a book, Fredley and I, discussing these issues. About mainstream being not open to alternatives. Well, David tells us that yes, they are, but I mean, our experience is that it's pretty difficult. Especially if someone tells us that if an idea is good, then it automatically should be expressed into a DSG model. About how much the students can take, it's true that what's striking with the ManQ textbook is that it's hyper simple. You were making the comment that our first year book was overly complicated. And retrospectively, I think you're right. There are too many pages. But on the other hand, I made a book review of Macroeconomics. It was the second edition, and it is true that as I read your book, I'm talking about the Macroeconomics textbook. The neoclassical stuff seems easy to read, but whenever you make a critique or you talk about Veblen and all that, it's more sophisticated. My feeling was that a student reading that textbook needed better reading skills, reading all the parts about the critiques, than reading the traditional ManQ microeconomic textbook. Christophe asked about, is it true the textbooks are led by the demand? And I would say there's a principal agent problem here, to use the neoclassical terminology, in the sense that there is a number of students who would like to have something different, but the lecturers usually don't, for the reasons that were explained by David. Ivan asked, does the change come from inside or outside? Should be both. It's difficult. I find it hard to answer to your question. And finally, about what Jonathan said, defending the money multiplier in the quantity equation. There's nothing wrong in having the quantity equation in the textbook. What I think is wrong is that there is no critique of it. You're saying inflation is determined by the money supply, and then there is no discussion about what about the possibility that the money supply would be determined by the nominal GDP. So this is what I found annoying. And about the money multiplier, it's just wrong. It's wrong. The central bankers are telling us it's a wrong interpretation, and so I really believe it shouldn't be there.
Well, actually, I think we have two perspectives on both of those things. That is, on the MV equals PQ, we say that the quantity theory has significant problems. We do talk mostly about liquidity issues. We don't talk about the reverse causation. I think we should. I mean, I think you're right there that we could be stronger on that post-Keynesian endogenous money. Maybe we backed off it just because we thought that there's a lot there already, and if you're going to get into endogenous money theory, that will be one thing too many, but I think we shouldn't have. Also, I think at this conference, what is percolating to me is that the post-Keynesian perspective is more of a consistent theoretical perspective that should and can be presented to students as such. And we have it in an appendix, and our basic dichotomy in the book is between classical Keynesian. So we don't get much more sophisticated than that. Again, partly on the theory that it's a bit confusing to students, that if you talk about neoclassical, new Keynesian, post-Keynesian, that they're going to say, what? There are 5 different schools, which one is right? But I think we do underplay some of these things, but there's always another edition.
Well, we look forward to the 3rd edition, I'm tempted to say. Sorry, Marc, did you have... okay, wonderful. Now, I already have 7 people in my list, so I'll take them, and I may have one more at most, but yes, at the back with Christian, we're starting. Okay, there's one.
I'd like to...
And I'm now closing, because I have already 2 more colleagues. Yes, sorry, you go ahead.
I'm Christian Schoder from Vienna University of Economics and Business. I'd like to pose a question to Marc, which is...
Du musst mehr ins Mikro sprechen.
All right. I have a question to Marc, which is, don't you think... Or the question is, why do you think our heterodox ideas, why don't they benefit from the current crisis in economics and the economy? Don't you think that this is also related to some homemade problems? We know from the 1970s that those people who are now mainstream have criticized these traditional Keynesian models, at least because of 2 main reasons: because of their assumption of stable parameters in the behavioral relationships, and because of the assumption of backward-looking expectations. So when it comes, for instance, to expectations, we like to quote Keynes, who said the current state of affairs will continue indefinitely, except in as far as there are specific reasons to change. But what we actually assume in post-Keynesian models is the current state of affairs will continue indefinitely, full stop. Let me give you an example, and then I'm done with the question. If Mario Draghi announces that the ECB would do anything to save the euro area, this actually turned out to save the euro area, but it would not have any effect in the post-Keynesian model. So don't you think that there's some shortcomings within the research framework, the paradigm, that we should address and which may have contributed to the marginalization?
Can we get the mic here to Marika?
Hi, it's Marika Frangakis from Poulantzas Institute in Athens. Just a comment, really. In 2009, just after the crisis broke out, the mainstream economics and mainstream economists came under a lot of fire. The FT, the Economist, carried articles on this. I remember the Economist had a cover showing a book with economics sort of textbook actually melting down. And the Queen went to the LSE and said, how come nobody saw this coming? And there were a number of letters written. Well, the mainstream people at LSE said, well, we each did our job very well, but it was collectively that we missed it. So anyway, my comment is, it seems to be a shame, a great shame, that 5 years later, things have just died down. The dust is back on mainstream orthodox economics being taught. And I do have a question there. I mean, I haven't really followed this up. But Jared Epstein, economics is the one profession that has no code of conduct. I mean, sociologists do, right? So Epstein, as far as I know, submitted a proposal at the American Economics Association proposing that such a conduct be introduced. I actually wrote to Epstein and he said nothing has happened. But maybe something has happened. I'm just not aware of it. Thanks.
Brilliant. There's a student colleague there at the back. Female. Next to you. I thought it was next to you. No? Didn't you want? Okay, apparently not. So it's you.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Ludwig List. I'm currently in the Epoch Master Program. My question would regard, on one side, the question about if you want to talk about heterodoxy, orthodoxy or not. But I think a very, very, very important advantage of talking about heterodoxy and orthodoxy, especially if you're talking to non-economists, is that it actually makes you aware about the different political power positions in economics, especially in teaching, and how different schools of thought are being treated, which is something that nobody outside of economics usually actually understands, because they think it's just a social science as every other social science. So in this kind of sense, it would make sense to me to actually talk about heterodoxy and orthodoxy, just to talk about the current school being in power, or in having the hegemony. The other thing I wanted to ask is also linking the questions about maybe we're a bit, the problem also comes a bit from our own. Wouldn't it make sense to actually make a MOOC, like an online course, dedicated to several heterodox schools of thought? Because at the moment, there is nothing out there that I could find on those current online course platforms. It's a rather cheap way for departments or teachers to actually spread other views concurring to neoclassical theory. And at the same time, it could present it all over again, and all students that would look for a different master after doing a neoclassical bachelor's program, for example, could get a grasp of what kind of teachers are out there. Thank you.
Brilliant. I thought Glenn wanted to ask something too. Was I wrong? No obligation. Okay, sorry. You were just stretching. Then it's Andrew here. Andrew. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Andrew Watt from the IMK. Thanks very much for the presentations. There was a lot of talk about this pressure to have highly successful economics textbooks. I'm surprised that no one else has pointed out what seems to me a slightly obvious point, which is that by far the most successful economics book of our time, if not the textbook, is the book now being discussed by Thomas Piketty. If I think about the characteristics of that book, amongst others, there's this very detailed work on data, a lot of historical perspective, some degree of formalization, of theoretical formalization, but quite limited and quite basic and arguably perhaps also not always correct, and a sort of interdisciplinary approach which combines historical work and also more sociological and other social science work. And lastly, dealing with an issue that's in a very explicitly normative way and not pretending to be, have a purely positive view, and dealing with an issue that's really very relevant to the lives of billions of people. And I wonder whether that is going to have an impact also, and I realize it's not a textbook in that sense, it can't serve as a model for textbooks, but do the panelists think that might have an impact now, given the obvious popularity of that book, given that I guess the publisher has made millions and millions with his book, that this may have an impact on the way economics textbooks are conceived and sold?
Over to Robert. Front to the front. It was Robert before you. Sorry, yeah.
I'm Robert Blecker from American University in Washington. Thank you all for the stimulating presentations. I have a few comments. First of all, I think we should not exaggerate what is easy and understandable for beginning or even intermediate undergraduate. When I have tried to teach that ASAD thing and then do a critique, it's hard to get the students past what all those automatic shifts are. They either memorize it without understanding it for the most part, or they just fall apart. I mean, I never even get to the critique. It is not easy to understand. And I think doing something simpler that actually maybe is what heresy, based in reality, might be better. It's not impossible to change textbooks. Even in the mainstream, there is change. Like there's one intermediate macro text that is given up on a fixed money supply and an LM curve. At least one, I think maybe more. It's the Charles Jones intermediate text. So he just jettisoned all that. There's a lot of other stuff in that book I might critique, but he got rid of the fixed money supply and the LM curve. He has essentially a Taylor rule monetary policy thing. You can make change. And now, I was also going to talk along the lines of this student suggested, does the new technology not give us some potential? And I don't know about MOOCs. That requires a whole lot of capital and resources that we may not have, unless INET blesses us with a very big grant. But it seems to me that the ability to create online modules like GDay at Tufts has done, we may not compete directly head on with the textbook thing that has all these teaching resources, but we can provide ammunition for teachers who want to provide another perspective on things, and that we really ought to focus on that instead of just continuing to focus on the book market, because I think David is absolutely right about where publishing is going. And then just one last thing. I actually spent the last 2 years doing something I thought was almost completely useless, which was helping to get my university reaccredited. It did save my job, at least until my job gets abolished, so I guess that was useful.
25 or 30 years. So.
But there is a move going on in higher education circles to change the way we do undergraduate education, at least, to move more in the direction of critical thinking and problem solving rather than sort of content dumping into students' brains. Now, if I understood what you said, David, about the changes in publishing, the idea is not to change the idea of content dumping, it's to create a more impressive, electronic, beautiful, high-tech delivery vehicle, but the idea is the same. And so this drive of the publishers, and I see where that's coming from, may yet come into conflict with some other moves in higher education, because I don't think that model is going to deliver critical thinking and problem solving. And that's where, if we think outside the box, we might come up with ways to teach better economics with or without a label. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Brilliant. Just to the back, yes.
I think that the crisis, the big crisis of the last years has begun with economics, the crisis of economics. And many 2 or 3 generations of politicians have now studied neoclassical economics. That's a big problem. And my proposal is that every student of economics should study science theory from the first year, science theory, and also, of course, history of economics. And the second point is we must change our methods of teaching. And it was in the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, we did it. Yes, we changed our methods of teaching and learning. And the most important form was the project studying. We tried to learn by searching. That's an important point. Thank you.
Wonderful. And last point here in the front. Right. Okay, I'll make a positive discrimination for our students who have not spoken sufficiently, and we hadn't had enough women speaking. So, Glenn.
Yeah, I changed my mind.
Who's not
Sorry
stretching
about
now?
that. Hi, everybody. I am Glenn. I'm in the EPOC program as well, and I'm from the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, the southmost island. I would just like to say that I think in the consideration of how economics should be thought, we should also consider integrating economists and thoughts from geographic areas outside of Western Europe and the US, especially with the idea that, we are in a globalized world and that models, as has been said right now, are not representing everything, just pieces of the puzzle. And in order to cater to our globalized problems, we need to get pieces of the puzzle from the other areas that have a lot to contribute. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, brilliant. And last contribution, the first row. On the first row, the colleague here. The first row.
It's the first.
First.
Remark to David, I think. You say we need models in order to systematize our ideas, which is correct, but, and that's the point in the aftermath of Kuhn and Feierabend, I don't like to mention Lakatos, the philosophy of science teaches you that different views of the world are possible, and different views of the world, of course, call for different models. So what Lakatos would ask you is whether your argument that everything is so complex and we've got to go into complexity theory might stem from the problem that you set out from a model which is the model of a basically incorrect worldview and then try to assimilate it to a quite different world. So just for the consequence for textbooks, wouldn't it be better in a course on Principles 101 to introduce students with simple models into different kinds of thinking? To tell them, well, that's the result I would get with a Keynesian idea. Those are the results which I would get with a neoclassical idea. Those are the basic assumptions. Now it's up to you to choose which direction you want to go into in Economics 201 or so.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So the last round of responses, 3 minutes, 3.5. Okay, 3 to 5 minutes, and well, we have.
Sorry, I'd like to do a question quickly.
Very, very quick.
Very quickly. I miss in all talks about the complexity. Okay. I miss in all talks about the complexity of the use of mathematics in economics. Okay. 20 years ago, Paul Krugman commented in his blog that significant part of the graduate student in the US, especially at MIT, came from mathematics and physics. In his bestseller, Capital in the 20th Century, Thomas Piketty in the introduction also criticizes the complexity of mathematical economics. Okay? I'd like you talk about this.
Thank you very much. So, shall we start with you, Marc, this time?
All right. Well, Christian Schroeder put a question to me about the stability of parameters. I guess he's referring to the Lucas critique. I never could make any sense of it, so I cannot really reply to what you're saying. About Draghi telling that he will do everything he can to save the euro. You're saying that this could not be incorporated in a post-Keynesian model? Well, I would say that goes into a change in liquidity preference. Suddenly people realize that there is less uncertainty than there was before. The lady in red, I'm sorry, I didn't catch you. Monica. Well, basically you're making a comment similar to that of Tom Polly, which is that economists should be convicted, well, charged and convicted. Oh, okay.
Radically.
Heterodox, orthodox, well, when I teach first year, I don't make these complicated distinctions that you mentioned between whatever schools. I just talk about the good guys, who are essentially the Keynesians, and the bad guys. Shouldn't we have something online, some books, or various pedagogical material, well, certainly, and the INET is very keen on having that. The only trouble is that they got Wendy Carline to get this going, and she's a new Keynesian, so it's not going to be very alternative. Yes, Piketty did a wonderful job in getting attention, but we cannot all be John Kenneth Galbraith or Hal Brenner, So these guys also have sold hundreds of thousands of books. Well, yes, I think I'll stop here. About complexity, I had a paper explaining, discussing Minsky back in 1983. I had also various, you have a pattern of tranquility, which suddenly you have bifurcation. So I was using all this vocabulary which was being used in biology, but I'm just not sure how far we can go with this. In any case, we have macroeconomic accounting laws. So, I wonder if these complexity models take that into consideration. So I still think that the post-Keynesian tradition, with its focus on macroeconomic laws, and which brings in many constraints, as has been pointed out by Lance Taylor, I still think that this has a very important role to play in explaining macroeconomics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. David?
Very briefly, sort of one question was sort of going back to 2009, sort of what happened and everything else. Again, sort of within that sort of critique then, I had a paper with a group of people, The Ethical Failure of the Economics Profession, where we really argue that went viral sort of early on. Because here you had a whole group of what were considered mainstream economists saying there really was an ethical failing. So I think you can come out and say that.
Aha, so you're a mainstream economist.
I'm a mainstream economist. I said you're a mainstream economist too, because you do good economics. So it isn't that here I'm mainstream and you're heterodox, it's that we're all mainstream. You're better off saying we, own the space. Don't give the space away is my argument, not sort of saying here, they will call me heterodox lots of times. They'll call me lots of things, but so that doesn't bother me.
John Wick suggests calling the other economics such that we are the economics, right. But yeah.
We do real world economics.
And, I think mainstream economists try to do real world economics. It's whether it's good economics or bad economics. In terms of sort of different schools of thought and everything else, I'm very much in favor of it. But again, I'm really hesitant to talk about neoclassical, because then I have to include Marshall, who had a quite different approach than Walras, with that who had a quite different approach than Samuelson, who has, now we've all evolved into behavioral economics, which sort of has a whole other set of dimensions that are going on. There's so many interesting developments that are occurring there. To fit it all under one umbrella that, just is the bad stuff, I don't think is a useful way of doing it. There's good stuff and bad stuff. In terms of Robert's, sort of discussion, yes, I agree very much, sort of in terms of, sort of the need to provide these modules. I think it would be a useful thing to come out of this conference, actually, for people to decide, let's provide some of these modules. But I think another part of it is what I call curating. Sort of providing, here is some resources available, and sort of develop that as a process. Here, there's lots of really good stuff online from lots of different perspectives. It just has to be curated, and I think, that's a really important part, and it actually should be done. Strongly encourage it. It was very much part of sort of what I argued to INET, and on there we're in agreement. I think the way INET went, was not the way I felt it should have gone. In terms of, sort of every student should study science, I agree completely. They should study science, should study history of economics. That I'm not so sure. I think it's wonderful if they did, but try and say, who's going to teach it? So you go out there and look, sort of there. I remember some of my history of thought classes which were truly awful. somebody sort of going through here, this happened, this happened, this happened. To teach history of thought right is a really difficult thing because it talks about the nuances of ideas and debates about people. We do not have a group of people out there who can teach history of thought now. So even though I have a history of thought book, strong supporter of it, I'm not saying here we should introduce it because we don't have anybody out there to teach it, and we're not even teaching anybody, to be able to teach it. Sorry? Okay, yes. There are a few. As opposed to, geographical areas, I totally agree. And sort of part of my proposal to INET was really to have authors coming from all around the globe, not just the US, and to sell the book as the first sort of global, principles book that looked at issues not just from this Western perspective, that I think, so really is a limitation that goes on. Totally agree with you. And finally, in terms of, sort of models and everything else, I don't think I quite followed everything that was there, but, sort of different views are possible in terms of my text, what I try and provide. So he provides here, Keynesian view is right, the other view is wrong. What I provide is here there's different models, they lead to different conclusions. I'm not here to tell you which is right and wrong. That you'll have to figure out. But I am here to sort of show you, here's the logical way of structuring it. And I think good economists do it that way. I just did a review of a book that Tom Sargent had done. And Tom sort of discussed two, sort of models that were using DSGE models. One came and it blew up the system and one not. And he ended this discussion with, I don't know which is right, but that's the correct use of models. Models can lead in lots of different directions. Then you have to figure out what's the right time, right place for the use of the particular models. And that is not something we can teach in principles, and it's very, very hard to teach overall. So thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, I have 3 quick points. One is on complexity. I would just say complexity is not bad in itself, but it's bad if it conceals bad assumptions. On the obsolescence of professors, I think if that's a trend, we should resist it, and we should resist it vigorously and not just out of self-interest. I think it's critical to maintain in education interaction, discussion, as was mentioned, critical thinking, problem solving, and I don't think you can do that entirely in an online environment. I think we should use technology rather than be captured by it. Then on this point about integrating economic thinking and perspectives outside of the US and Europe, very, very important. That's an area where technology can be used positively. We've found it's useful to jump over the high price of textbooks by providing free online materials. We got a response from somebody in Bolivia who said her whole curriculum was based on our modules, which can all be downloaded for free. So there's a vertical advantage to that sort of free availability, which could encourage and promote more interaction between the US and Europe and the developing world. We've also used CD-ROMs, free distribution of CD-ROMs with like 10,000 articles on them to get material out there where libraries simply otherwise can't afford to get it. And one final comment on David's remark that our aggregate supply curve is empirical. I like that, and I like the fact in particular that it has that flat horizontal section which indicates quantity adjustment rather than price adjustment. I agree there's a certain amount of hand-waving on the aggregate demand curve, but I think the model as a whole works.
Let me I didn't answer one question about mathematics sort of there, and I think that's one issue that would come up. Mathematics is a language, so it may be useful, it may not. If you're forced to discuss something in a language you're not comfortable with, then it's not especially useful at all. But it's a language that can look very, very deeply at sets of issues that are there, and so people who are really sort of pushing the deep level, I say, do the mathematics. The problem with the DSGE model, in my view, is it's way, way too simple mathematics. It sort of uses linear, sort of non-linear dynamics, so it sort of forces all the really interesting issues out of it. So complexity is nothing but saying, here, let's sort of add all the assumptions to make it fit in, and guess what you find? you find pretty much anything can happen. So therefore, you use the mathematics to show the models at that level aren't going to give you anything, and you're going to have to make the type of assumptions you do. But then you put the debate about the assumptions, not about the models themselves.
Apparently, Marc has also remembered something else that he wanted to add.
Just one thing I want to say is the reason I'm a bit more, I'm a bit pessimistic about the future of heterodox economics. But the reason I am perhaps more optimistic than pessimistic is precisely because we have these online resources that did not exist 30 years ago, and therefore we can access people from everywhere in the world at a very low cost. And in fact, I'm told that all these work, Zimmerman, what is it called, REPEC, or it's something. I'm told that the papers on heterodox topics get downloaded more often than those written by mainstream authors. So I think this is the encouraging part.
Okay. I just want to add that if there is any hiring panel who is trying to meet the demands of their students to headhunt for young talent who dares to teach competing theories, history of thought, I think they should come to our conference, to the graduate session. There are all these brilliant young PhD students as well as young lecturers who seem to be quite well equipped to do that. I know just a number of these people who are preparing actually changes in the existing curriculums in some of our universities. But so I just want to end by saying the situation is serious but not hopeless, to just stay true to the spirit of Berlin leftists who has said that years ago here. But so let me just conclude by thanking all our three speakers as well as all the contributors to this brilliant discussion. Thank you very much.